So then we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This day is very important because the prophecies of Yahweh, the true Creator, He is in fact in charge of the universe, and His holy prophecies must come and be completed. So then, understanding from the viewpoint of Shimon, he was a Shaliach, and he had also the endowment from Ruach HaKodesh. He was in fact also teaching the people, and his teachings very understandably were then directed to his own countrymen, because he had in fact the plan of salvation regarding then the Gentiles, and the understanding of this plan was then given via Moshe and the first service establishment. So then Moshe, obviously he started then the first service when he brought the people out of Egypt, and there they were slaves in the land, and the mighty hand of the Creator then decided to take them out of the land of Egypt. So with a mighty hand and a strong arm he brought them out via Moses, and then they came through then the Red Sea and then encamped near the mountain. So then the people were there, and then Moshe himself at some point he went up the mountain and he visited with the Creator. His name is Yahweh, and he had a plan for them. So then Moshe then obviously came down from the mountain, and from bits and pieces he was then placing together the first service. So then the people then they built the tabernacle, and that's where then Yahweh was then maintained, and that's where he was then found. So then when Moshe, every time he was up on a mountain and he came down, he had more parts of these great understanding. So then the tabernacle that Moshe saw while he was on a mountain, it was simply a sketch of what he had in terms of what he should do in the future regarding the temple and its services. Some people they theorize that there is a temple in heaven or a tabernacle in heaven, when in fact it does not, because the service of the tabernacle is for the people of the earth. There is no reason for a tabernacle in heaven. The translation was unfortunately translated wrong, and what Moshe saw, he saw in the spirit the design of the tabernacle, and also the utensils, and the way he should then set them up while he then came down from the mountain. He was then pondering, and then obviously he was then placing in practice what he saw on the mountain. But there is no tabernacle in heaven. There is a link from the presence of the Creator in the earth, in His holy tabernacles, and then linked with the previous tabernacle, and then those areas they have no time elapsing from each of those times. When speaking of the Spirit, time is not then counted. What it does is the presence is through the time. It doesn't count the time from Moshe's time when he was on the mountain, and then when they set up the tabernacle, and then the presence of Elohim in the tabernacle, then in a temple. Later then the tabernacle would be portable around the world, forming holy lands and then shepherding the Gentiles. Each of the tabernacles, they have no time restriction. So the plan of Moshe, when he received a sketch of what this presence is. So what people are then confused is the presence of Elohim versus the area of sketching of his holy tabernacle. And there is no relation with them. Because what causes people to make mistakes in terms of the tabernacle, because they include time in it. Time is not a factor. But the problem with the time is when people begin to understand from Greco-Roman understanding, then they begin to try to understand in a flat surface, and then timing counts. However, in a spirit, there is no counting of time. It is a special link from heaven and the earth, and time is not counted. Presence of Elohim, near presence of Elohim, nearing line or nearing presence is related with the spirit, and time is not counted. That's why many people, they get confused. They think there is a tabernacle in heaven. No, it does not have a tabernacle in heaven, because the tabernacles are for the earth. Elohim is the tabernacle. He does not want tabernacle up there. The tabernacle is for the earth, so people can be near him in the earth, while the earth is then sinful. There is no sin in heaven, therefore no reason for tabernacle in heaven. So then Moshe, when he came down from the mountain, he was then endowed, and he came from another realm of understanding. When he then came out of the mountain and he began to be mixed with the people, then time began to count. When he was up on a mountain, time was not then taken in consideration. As you can understand, Moshe was up on a mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And at some point they had a meal up there with the 70 elders. Those were then another type of realm that we don't understand. So there is no tabernacle in heaven. If you would have then in the past a dream, in this dream you would have some sort of a design in your mind, you can't say then where do you live is then your dream. You can't live in your own dream. However, you can refer back to your dream via your mind. But as long as you think of the project that you had in your mind, you can understand you don't think of time thinking of it, do you? No, it simply comes to your mind and there it is. In terms of having the plan, there is no time counted. Therefore, people, they are mistaken thinking that there is a tabernacle in heaven when there isn't. What Moshe saw was a sketch from heaven while he was observing the spiritual realm. And then Shaul later said that a friend of his, he knew a person that then more than 10 years prior of the time that he wrote was then caught up in a third heaven, and he could not say the words explaining it. It was another realm. So there is no tabernacle in heaven. So then Shimon, he was explaining then to his countrymen, we must understand, Shimon was directing those words in 1st and 2nd Shimon because his people then were affirmed regarding the work of Elohim in their lives, and that they should dedicate their lives to Elohim himself while then shepherding the Gentiles. So then Shimon was very specific when he said, and then he speaks of the end of times. So then we understand Shimon was then talking with his people, and a lot of his people from the first, they were very caught up in many rebel actions. They did not understand the work of the Messiah. So while then he was speaking with the people that were against him, then he had an understanding of the end of times. So then Shimon, he said then, very in a specific sense, starting at the first verse of the third chapter, he states, "This second Megillah, my brethren, writing to you, so then it would encourage you." Okay? Stir up does not exist from Hebraic understanding. What he's saying is this: encouragement of remaining loyal to the Torah. This is what he's saying. But in enlightenment of grace imputed in the Torah, as per then Hebrews the 5th chapter. Then honest mind by admonition. He was then encouraging them of returning to their original state. They had to be then in their camps, and they would cluster together because this was the design from the Creator. The Creator wanted His people of being a secluded people. Only Creator's people. This was the plan given by Shimon. He is simply explaining what was before. It's not new. It's not new information. He was simply enforcing what they were taught previously. But then the people got tempted with the world, and they ended up then rejecting the very plan that the Creator had for them. So then Shimon, he is encouraging his people, and then in the second verse, that you may be mindful, that you remind yourselves of the words that were formerly spoken by the set-apart prophets. Precisely then what the prophets were then speaking earlier. The prophets, they were sent simply then to point the people back to the instructions. So then, and the orders of then the Messiah, because the Messiah came and he explained the entire salvation plan, the entire Torah. He explained the whole history of humanity. The reason why the Messiah is returning as the judge is because what was explained was then it. He explained whatsoever was important regarding human or humans, and then there is not another word that should be spoken that is new. The Messiah spoke already what had to be spoken. That's why he's returning as the judge, because there is no new ideas in terms of the salvation plan. So then Shimon continues, and he is simply encouraging his people, and then he's then speaking. Then he said, by the hand of the Shilishim, like himself, he was a Shaliach, and orders were given from heaven through Ruach HaKodesh to the other Shilishim. And this is what he's saying. In other words, he's saying simply, don't think this is a new teaching. There were then people before me, Shimon, that came and explained this to you. And then in the third verse, knowing this previously, that there will come in the last days mockers, who will then mock, walking after their own lusts. As we understand, the Messiah, he was the Messiah of the Word, and the Torah is yet active. Only half of it was completed. Whatsoever the Messiah did, he would expect his people to do what he did, his people then being the set apart, and then the set apart would live by example without forcing the Gentiles. But then whosoever is of the Messiah wanted also the works of the Messiah. Whatsoever the Messiah did, so then the people would do. Normal factor of being of the Messiah. If the Messiah then he kept the first law, then must we. And the second, the third, the fourth, also the Shabbat, also included. So then his people that set apart would do in their camps, and then encouraging the Gentiles of showing up at the gates for further instructions. So then he states that these mockers would come after their own lusts. They would sin and try to justify. So then, in saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers, then he's speaking of the people previously, those who were given to them as people endowed by the presence of Elohim, they went to rest. Remains as was then before and from the creation. Then for these they also forget, for the heavens of old and the earth rose up from the waters, and by the means of the water, he then speaking from the start. By means of these then the world came, and then of course he speaks there in the 7th chapter, and the heavens that now are, and the earth, and then the word, and then he explains then from the start. And for these, brethren, be not forgetful, that a day concerning Yahweh is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. So then, Yahweh is not delaying regarding his promises, as some people have the idea that Yahweh already did what he had to do, and he's simply returning as the Savior because he's returning as the judge to complete the second half of the Torah. Then, but he is then a person that is limiting himself, and then while waiting for his holy prophecies then to take place. So then, understanding what Shimon was then speaking, then he reminds his people, because for their sakes, then he is doing this, or Elohim is then kind of retracting himself a bit, and he puts up with a lot of junk for our benefit. That's what Shimon is saying. But there everyone should come to repentance. And the day of Yahweh will come like a thief. He's speaking of the Creator. So then the thief that he's speaking of is regarding then the temple service. So then during the time the temple was then erected by Shimon, there was obviously in Chronicles, you find then the rotation of the priests. Sometimes the priests during the night, they would come to rest. The understanding of resting has to do when a person leaves this earth and goes to rest. A person dies in the flesh, and then if a person dies with the Mashiach, then a person goes to rest. It's the resting of the soul. So during the time that this idea is given, then was the time that the priests were in the holy temple, and sometimes at night they would stoke up the fire with lots of logs, and then they would go to rest. They would lay down in a temple and they would rest, where they should be standing up and they should service and do their work to Elohim 24/7. They should never rest in the temple. But then at times when there were people over there, some of them were resting, and then the high priest would come in a time that a person was not expecting. And there was then the service priest over there lying and then, resting. And then the high priest would sneak in and would catch the person resting over there, whereas the person should be standing up and servicing Elohim. And then he would get the shovel and would get hot coals from the fire and would place these coals around the garment of the lying priest. And then afterwards a person would stand up with his clothing burning. So this is the idea of coming as a thief in the night. We think as Gentiles that then is like a thief would be a person outside then thieving around. But the idea that Messiah then spoke with Shimon, and the idea of Shimon is explaining of the priest. A priest caught resting during the time of duty. So the Messiah, when he comes, related with his set apart, because the Gentiles are going to be gone by the 6th chapter of Revelation. So then Shimon has a link with Revelation without knowing it, because Shimon wrote his Megillahs prior of Yohanan. Yet he had a link, because he had the understanding from the cities of the plain. Sodom and the other cities that were destroyed by the shower of the sulfur, burning sulfur. If you go to Sodom, over there, the cities of the plain, you find those pieces of sulfur that came from heaven. You light up a match to it and it comes out a blue flame. And you can melt metal because it's so strong and it's so powerful flame. So then, what then Shimon is explaining then is the very end of this age, or the end of this earth. So then, and he's speaking of the thief in the night. And then the heavens will very fastly be then destroyed, and then the elements being ignited will be then destroyed, and the earth and the works in it will not be found. So in the spirit, Shimon had the idea, and he had the anointing in his life. He had the understanding that then the earth would be then obviously destroyed via a shower of sulfur. Thus the prophetic shadows is spoken of by Shaul the Shaliach. If you turn then to Hebrews, you would find prophetic shadows of the events to come, because he was explaining to his own people. So then he explains then the elements being ignited will to be then destroyed, and the earth and the works in it would not be found. That's when this age then ends. He is making a reference of Revelation, the 20th chapter and the 9th verse. Though he was speaking these words in 2 Shimon, the 3rd chapter and the 9th verse and 10th verse, he was then many years prior of Yohanan writing the Megillahs of Revelation. Then he explains, therefore, these are then destroyed, and what persons should you be in a set-apart conduct and in the fear of Elohim? He's not speaking of Gentiles, he's speaking of the very set apart. He's explaining these, you then set apart, you are part of this holy plan from of old. And the earth is going to be destroyed by a shower of sulfur. Because the second half of the Torah, the prophets and the writings, those are not yet completed. And Shimon is saying, be very cautious, set apart people, because whatsoever you are doing on your own. And then his people began to be busy with other areas, and they want to be busy with the world, they want to be busy with their own religions, they want to be busy with their own actions, they want to do their own plans. And then Shimon said, be cautious with it, because the works of the earth are going to be destroyed, as the cities of the plain were destroyed. This is what he's making a reference of. The shower of sulfur, it would come, and then we find the shower of sulfur in the 20th chapter in the 9th verse. This is when then the Messiah, he shows up as a thief in the night, in a time that no person knows. But then he shows up, as he would then, making an analogy of the high priest showing up in a temple and then caught the priest over there during duty time and then resting. This is what Shimon then is warning. Because Shimon then first is encouraging his own people on an understanding of the holy plan, so then they would understand what the Messiah then was expecting of them. However, the Messiah was not forcing his way upon his people, he was simply delegating responsibilities so they would have the privilege of being part of the holy plan. So then Shimon, he is not speaking with the Gentiles. Gentiles are not even part of it. Because the Gentiles then are gone by the 6th chapter of Revelation, as we understand. There he is then, while then the people were linked with each of the holy tabernacles, in each person in a geographical area, they are then linked with each tabernacle. And then while they are having this link, then many people are asking, what's going on, what's going on? We are outside and there are lots of tribulations. The great tribulation meant when vengeance then is enforced, and then the prophecies are in the very thick of it, then the Gentiles are going to be exterminated outside of the camps. And this is what Shimon then is explaining. He's explaining to the set apart. He's not explaining to the Gentiles. So when you read it in the 6th chapter, and then the people were asking outside the camp, and then they were relaying the information via spirit to the priests, and they were relaying to heaven, stating for how long, for how much longer, from how much longer. And then came a word from heaven, until the number of slaughterings are going to be completed. Then Gentiles are no more, and then from the 7th chapter until the end of Revelation speaks of only of the set apart in their camps and the beloved city. This is yet future. So then, understanding what Shimon was saying, then expecting and desiring the coming of the day of Elohim, is speaking of the vengeance. Shimon is explaining of the desire of the completion of the second half of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, known as Revelation. These can be very new information for those that are Gentiles and then always taught as in Greco-Roman understanding. But from a Hebraic understanding, that's trivial. As you make a calculation, 5 plus 5 is 10, so then from a Hebraic understanding, what's new? This is very known. And then Shimon, he explains very simply, but then we, after his promise, expect new heavens and a new earth. After the shout of sulfur, then comes the new heaven and the new earth. That's when then the second layer of understanding, because if you read precisely what Shimon is saying, he's giving you a dual layer understanding. He's explaining of the existing age in a level of layer, and the new earth is another layer. Take this understanding and compare with then Shaul the Shaliach, understanding from the viewpoint of people coming from the dead. The people coming from the dead is the second layer. And what layer is then Shimon making a reference of the new earth? Is the second layer. Both layers, they coincide. So gives you the understanding what then Shaul was speaking of. He was speaking of the people coming from the dead in the new earth. Then they are becoming more aware of, and then people were coming from their resting places in the new earth. That's when those that went and they died in Messiah first are going to be raised first. And those after. So then the first layer speaks of then the termination of the existing age. And the first layer of Shaul the Shaliach also explains of the ending of this age. So you can make a link, first layer Shimon and Shaul. And that makes perfect sense. So then he was explaining and encouraging his people to remain loyal to the Torah and the prophets, wishing for the new heaven and the new earth, where then they would be secured for eternity. But there is a whole lot more, because then the second layer related with then the completion of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and then the closing of the age, makes a very interesting reading, because then the myth of this idea that the Torah, the prophets, and the writings were abolished can be absolutely destroyed, because the Torah is active, because Torah, the prophets, and the writings, those are related with the spiritual realm, and time does not count. When people make a division from what the Torah is and what was abolished or not, they use the word abolishment because they have time interfering with their thoughts. But they never realized, because they were always taught from plain understanding, flat surfaces. Then they have to include the time. In a spiritual understanding, there is no time counted. So then, second portion yet must be completed, and Revelation is linked with then Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, making then Revelation a much more understanding writing, and then much more coming up later, and many more explanations. Please stay tuned.